Hi guys, it's me, ChazzaHD, and welcome to the end of season content here in 2024. And in this video, we are getting into the driver rankings for the 2024 Formula 1 season. Of course, I did do this at the mid-season point, but I decided to do this driver rankings for the season as a whole. Decided to do it as a separate video, separate from the live stream I'm going to be doing this Sunday, live at 1 PM UK time on the channel, where I'm going to be reviewing the season as a whole, looking at the teams and all the other stuff from 2024. So yeah, this video is purely going to be looking at or ranking all of the drivers that raced in 2024, and that will be from 24th all the way to first place. And of course, we'll be starting from 24th and going all the way up to first. And simply in this video, I'm going to go through each driver, explain why I've ranked them in the position I have, and then we'll go obviously all the way up to first place, and then I'll let you guys fight in the comment section over who should be where in the 24 order. So let's start off with 24th place, and 24th place has to be Jack Doohan, really, because we just don't really know what his performance could have been in 2024. Of course, he only did one race, the final race in Abu Dhabi, was miles off the pace of his teammate. Obviously, the Alpine car was very quick in that final race, so definitely there was a lot more pace there to be had if Doohan could have found it, but he wasn't able to. So that's why I've gone for him in 24th place, because only one race done and he didn't really do anything. So we can't really rank him any higher than 24th place. But going on to 23rd, we have a driver who did, just over half the season in the Williams, and then was sacked after the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort after a massive crash. And that was Logan Sargeant. Logan was very lucky to be on the grid for 2024, to be honest. 2023, he was miles behind Alex Albon, and I'm pretty sure the Williams team boss, James Vowles, was looking for a replacement for 2024, but just couldn't find one that, in his eyes, was clear, going to be an improvement on, Logan Sargeant. And then eventually he did find a driver in Franco Colapinto, who came in and did, I think, a really good job considering the circumstances and considering the pace of the Williams car in that part of the season. So, yeah, Logan, in 2024, just like 2023, miles behind his teammate, not just in the amount of times he was beaten in qualifying, but the lap time difference between the two was absolutely massive and could not be tolerated. So, yeah, Logan, 23rd in this list. 22nd is the Sauber driver, no longer, of Zhou Guanyu. A driver that I've never really thought was good enough to be in Formula 1. I just never really believed in the guy. Wasn't really that amazing in Formula 2. I'm not going to say he was bad. He had some good results here and there, but I just never believed that this guy was a good enough Formula 1 driver. And in his time in Formula 1, he proved exactly that. Now, the Sauber car this year was the worst car on the grid. There's no doubt about that. But the reason I've got it ranked, so low is because not only the amount of times was he out-qualified by Valtteri Bottas, but again, the lap time difference between the two. There would be several qualifying sessions where Zhou would be out-qualified by Bottas. Zhou would end up last a lot of the time and be way over half a second per lap slower. That cannot be tolerated at all. And that's why Zhou, thankfully, will not be on the grid next year, and hopefully won't be on the grid at all in the future, because he is not good enough. If you are struggling to get anywhere near a past his prime Valtteri Bottas on lap time, you do not deserve to be in Formula 1. I'm sorry, you just don't. So, Zhou, 22nd in the list. And then 21st is teammate Valtteri Bottas. Again, the Sauber car was not good. The only reason I've got him ahead of Zhou is because he was better than Zhou factually in 2024. But even though the Sauber car was the worst on the grid. It wasn't, a 2019 Williams or anything like that. And there were opportunities where Bottas maybe could have, scraped a point during the season, but was just never able to because Valtteri is way past his prime and is no longer at a good enough standard for Formula One. So that's why I've got Valtteri Bottas so low. Both Sauber drivers, I think, were really quite poor during the season. And thankfully, Sauber have gone for a new driver lineup in 2025 of Nico Hulkenberg and the new Formula 2 champion, Gabriele Bortoleto. 20th place, Sergio Perez in the Red Bull. Now, as of recording this video, Perez has not been announced to have been dropped from Red Bull, so we'll see what happens with that. Maybe by the time this video comes out, he would have been dropped by the Red Bull team. But the reason I've got him so low in 20th place is because he ended up in a car that was regularly really able to fight for podiums and won still quite a few races in 2024. He only ended up with 152 points, which is nowhere near good enough for a driver of Sergio Perez's caliber compared to the midfield who, a lot of the midfield were, only 100 points behind Perez, which again cannot be tolerated because the Red Bull was so much faster than, say, the Alpine or the Haas or the Racing Bull or the Williams cars in 2024, that Perez should have been really 200 points clear at least of those cars or those drivers in the championship, but he only ended up 100 to 150 points clear. And the reason he was not that far clear, really, given the massive difference in car performance, is because Sergio Perez so many times, and especially the second half of the season, was struggling even to score points, never mind big points or anything like that. Of course, his really poor qualifying efforts also contribute to this ranking being so low. And yes, Sergio Perez, as much as I've loved him, I think he's had a great career. This last year and a half, he has been nowhere near the standard required and must be dropped by Red Bull. And maybe he'll come back into Formula One because he does have quite a lot of sponsorship money, that goes with him. But I would not be surprised if the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix that took place about a week ago, wouldn't be surprised if that was his last Grand Prix in Formula One. Perez is absolutely finished, I'm afraid. And yeah, qualifying, very, very poor. The races, very, very poor. Zero consistency, and started even making, towards the end of the season, some very poor mistakes. Go look at the Qatar Grand Prix, where he, at the start of the sprint race, seemingly was in another mental space, just didn't even bother to start from the pit lane, and Franco Colapinto behind him ended up overtaking him straight away out of the exit of the pit lane. So yeah, awful season by Perez, and he has got to go from Red Bull. 19th place, Lance Stroll. Now, the reason I've got Stroll ahead of Perez is purely because Stroll was closer to Alonso on performance this season than Perez was to Verstappen. Now, Alonso, of course, is not at the level of Verstappen. Alonso, I still think, is at a very good level, very high level, but Stroll was closer to Alonso on performance, and actually was closer to Alonso on performance this year compared to 2023. So that's why I've got Stroll ahead of Perez in 19th place, but still a poor season. If you go look at the championship standings, he was mixing it with, Ocon, behind Tsunoda in the championship, despite being in a faster car for probably most of the season. And that is just, you cannot tolerate something like that. And as I said in that video that did really well on my channel about this time last year, where I explained why Lance Stroll, I think, is finished in Formula One, Lance Stroll is never going to be any more than what he is. He is always going to be bang average at best, have the odd great race where he magically turns into an elite level driver, but most of the time it's going to disappoint or just be bang average. And if Aston Martin in the future want to win a world championship, especially the constructors, they cannot do it with Lance Stroll in their car. No way at all. 18th place, a driver that did not complete the season, but had his chance, really, in 2024 to prove himself, Daniel Ricciardo. We were all very hopeful coming into the season that Ricciardo would get back to the levels he was at, say, in 2020 with Renault, where he was one of the best drivers on the grid. But it's clear that after that Renault season, he has been past his prime, clearly past his prime ever since. Did have the odd good session, the odd good race. Obviously, the sprint race in Miami, I think he finished in 4th place. The Canadian Grand Prix weekend was a great weekend where he, I think, qualified 5th and finished in, was it 7th or 8th place? Had some other decent results, but was beaten too regularly by Yuki Tsunoda. And if Ricciardo was going to get his way back into the Red Bull, he had to be beating Tsunoda most times than not, and that just wasn't the case. Ricciardo was not able to do that. Now, could Ricciardo be on the grid? Is Ricciardo still good enough to be one of the 20 best in Formula 1? On his day, yeah, but that's the problem with Daniel Ricciardo at the moment, and that's why Ricciardo is done in Formula 1, because he cannot consistently produce those good performances anymore like he could back in the Renault days or, of course, the Red Bull days. That's just the simple reality with Daniel Ricciardo. He is clearly past his prime. I do hope that he goes on to have a good career elsewhere, say IndyCar or, something like that. I think he would, do well in America. But if he decides not to, and just have a chilled rest of his life, then no problem at all. He's had a great Formula 1 career. 17th place, I've gone Oliver Bearman. Now, obviously, Bearman only did, I think, 3 races it was, but in those 3 races, I saw enough from him, also considering just how young he is. You have to remember, in 2024, he's only been, 19? For how incredibly young he is to do what he did in, certain Grand Prix, obviously finishing in the top 10 for Haas in Baku was a fantastic result, and immediately being on the pace of his teammate, and I think may have out-qualified Hulkenberg in Baku. I'd have to go back and check, but and then obviously the first Grand Prix did in Formula 1 in Saudi Arabia for Ferrari, impressively finished in 7th place. Again, considering how young Bearman was at the time of making his debut and how inexperienced he is, to do what he did was super, super impressive. And I would say that what we saw from him in his only 3 races was more impressive, given the level of the car he was driving, than what Ricciardo, Stroll, or Perez or the rest did over the course of the season. So that's why I've got Oliver Bearman in 17th place. And just ahead of him is the driver he's replacing Bearman full-time for 2025. Can't wait to see Bearman in Formula 1 full-time. And the driver he's replacing, Kevin Magnussen, in 16th place. That Haas car was quick enough at most races to finish in the points, and Magnussen just did not finish in the points enough. Had the odd race where he was really good. Mexico was one race towards the end of the season where he was really strong, but those didn't happen enough. It was just too few and far between from Kevin Magnussen, and pretty much had the same season that he had in 2023, where again, had the odd race where he was in there, getting points for the team, but most of the time was just way away from where he should have been. And Magnussen obviously is now done in Formula 1. He's going to go and do, I think, is it GT racing for, was it BMW, I think I saw? Hopefully he does well in that. I know he's probably going to do something with his father in the future, maybe. I know he's talked about racing at Le Mans with his father. I don't know if they've already done that yet. If they haven't, then I hope they are able to do that at some point. But yeah, Magnussen, I think he's had a very good Formula 1 career considering the cars he's driven, the teams he's raced for. But unfortunately, like Sergio Perez, this last couple years has been past his prime, I'm afraid. And Magnussen definitely deserves to be off the grid for the foreseeable future. But yeah, Magnussen just not delivering enough in what was a pretty good midfield car in 2024. And just ahead of him, I've gone for what might be a surprise, but Liam Lawson in 15th place. Now, Lawson only did, how many races? I think 6 races, and it was the final 6 races of the season. But in those final 6 races, I saw enough to suggest that Liam Lawson was better performing than Magnussen over the course of 2024. Because Magnussen didn't really do that much over the season. And what Lawson did in those only 6 races, I think, was worth more than what Perez, Ricciardo, or Stroll did. The first Grand Prix back, he went from, 19th on the grid and ended up finishing in the top 10. Amazing result. Brazil was another one. Unbelievably tricky conditions, yet he finished in the top 10. And remember, that was the first time ever Lawson had raced around the Interlagos track. So to do it in those conditions and finish in the points, it just shows you how good this guy is. And maybe is Max Verstappen's teammate for 2025. If he is, good luck to him. But I think we've seen enough to suggest from Lawson that he was better than those drivers below him, and that he is definitely good enough to be in Formula 1. Now, whether he will be good enough for Red Bull, I honestly have no idea. I personally would have put Tsunoda in there, because I think Tsunoda, at the minute, is a better driver than Liam Lawson. Not by much, but just about. But that's the decision Red Bull have gone for. But as I said, good luck to Liam Lawson at Red Bull if that is where he's going. But if it's not, and he's at Racing Bulls, I think next year he'll do just fine, because that car should be decent enough for him to contend for points here and there, and probably over the course of the season will produce a few really good drives and have a decent season. So yeah, Lawson definitely good enough to be in Formula 1, and it's good to see that he's now going to be full-time on the grid, because really, in hindsight, he should have started the year at Racing Bulls alongside Tsunoda instead of Ricciardo, but Red Bull wanted to see if Ricciardo was good enough to come back for Red Bull, and ultimately he was not. Just ahead of Lawson, though, I've gone for, in 14th place, what might be quite a surprise to some people, Franco Colapinto. Yes, I was that impressed by Colapinto since he made his debut at Monza, that I have gone for him ahead of Lawson, Magnussen, Ricciardo, Stroll, Perez, Bottas, and the like. And the reason is because, one, how competitive he was with Albon in the races that he did. He was mixing it with Albon, something that Latifi and Sargeant were nowhere near able to do. Obviously, scored points for the team in very tricky conditions in Baku, I remember. Also, the race in, was it Sao Paulo? Or there was another race. No, not Sao Paulo. A race in Austin. He came from quite far back on the grid like Lawson did to finish in the points. And really, up until that Las Vegas Grand Prix, Colapinto was just such a delight on the grid. One of the real surprise performers that everyone was really excited about. And then, yeah, after that crash in Vegas, definitely was shook up after that. Now, in terms of, his form after that, yeah, there was a drop-off, but I don't think that was necessarily down to him entirely. The Williams car did also get a bit worse in those final couple races of the year. But I would be interested to see how Colapinto would do over the course of a season against, say, an Albon as a teammate, or a Pierre Gasly maybe. There is still rumours that Colapinto might be going to Alpine at some point next year. We'll have to see if that's true. But yeah, I was so impressed with what Franco Colapinto did in his only, what was it? Was it 8 races, I think it was? Or 9 races in Formula 1? Yeah, so impressed, and I cannot wait to see this guy back on the grid. And another thing that really does show his quality is a lot of the other drivers as well. even some of the top drivers were very impressed by him in terms of him, coming in and immediately getting on the pace and mixing it and even beating Alex Albon at times. In what is not exactly an easy car to drive. The Williams was probably one of the slowest and most difficult cars to drive on the grid, yet did what he did nonetheless. So, yeah, congratulations to Colapinto, for producing the brilliant races he did, and hopefully we will see him back, and I think definitely we are going to see him back, whether it's with Alpine in 2025, or, of course, the 11th new entry to Formula 1, Cadillac F1, they're going to be called, I think, at the moment, for 2026. I think they very likely could put Colapinto in their car. So, yeah, I think we'll definitely see the guy back. But, yeah, what a few races he did for Williams. Now let's go on to a bit of the, let's say, the upper midfield drivers for 2024. Esteban Ocon in 13th. Now, I have to say with Ocon, it was pretty hard to tell just how good he was this season. Obviously, in the first half of the year, the Alpine car was pretty bad. Had some decent results here and there. Of course, had a really good result in Brazil, finishing in second place. That, though, is almost entirely why he finished where he did in the championship, because he ended up with 23 points. 18 of them came in that single Grand Prix. So, yeah, it's difficult to say how good Ocon was exactly in the 2024 season. I know in the second half of the year, because Ocon, we all knew, was leaving, Alpine most probably gave Pierre Gasly more favourable parts to his car. Also, there was, Ocon, I think maybe complained about the chassis not being quite the same as maybe Pierre Gasly's, or there being a problem with it. The thing is, though, is if Ocon had the same as what Gasly had for the second half of the year, we can't sit here and guarantee where he would have ended up. Would he have had a couple more points finishes? Probably, but would he have been ahead of Gasly every single race? We can't sit here and say that, because again, it's too much of an unknown. So, yeah, I think 13th for Ocon, ahead of all the drivers behind, is where really he should be. And let's hope that he'll get back to the form more so of last year and the year before, where he was probably just about one of the top 10 best drivers on the grid. Obviously, next year will be at Haas alongside Oliver Bearman. What a exciting driver lineup that is, and what could be a pretty good midfield car next year. In 12th place, Alexander Albon. Now, this wasn't quite as maybe impressive of a season as it was in 2023. Obviously, 2023, the Williams car was better. They finished higher in the championship. But Albon still produced many great performances, getting into Q3 quite often, considering how slow the Williams was. And yeah, many points finishes still, and was still able to be a regular contender, fighting the Haases, fighting the Aston Martins at times. I mean, you even saw in the final race, came pretty close to finishing the points, fighting an Aston Martin and a McLaren for it. Albon, yeah, once again having a very good season. Obviously destroyed Logan Sargeant. Franco Colapinto he had a bit harder trouble with, but was still overall better than Colapinto, at least in qualifying. And yeah, he ended up still being the number one man at Williams. Of course, though, next year he will be teammates with Carlos Sainz, and next year is the real year for Albon where he needs to really be at his best, because if he can outperform Carlos Sainz next year and be clearly better than Sainz, then that might lead Albon to getting back into a Red Bull or a front-running car, because we know how good Carlos Sainz is. Carlos Sainz, probably one of the top, 5-6 drivers on the grid this season, maybe you could argue. Or, definitely in the top 10. So, if Albon does beat him, clearly, next year, then that is going to raise Albon's stock quite a bit. Will actually be probably Albon's most important season if he beats Carlos Sainz, because Obviously, the Red Bull, when he was at Red Bull, got hammered by Verstappen, but since he came back into Formula 1 with Williams, hasn't exactly had the greatest teammates to really show just how good Albon really is. So, yeah, cannot wait to see how he compares to Carlos Sainz in 2025. And it's great for Williams to have such a strong driver lineup. In 11th place, might be a tad surprising for some people, but I'm going to go for Nico Hulkenberg. And the reason is because whilst he was consistently good in qualifying, had quite a few points finishes, especially towards the end of the season, if you go back and look at the results he had in the races, he just was not, in my view, in the points enough, especially considering how good the Haas car was over the course of the year. Haas really should have finished 6th in the championship, but they didn't. Alpine ended up getting ahead of them and finishing ahead of them by, I think, was it 6 points or something like that, or 7 points? Now, yeah, Alpine improved a lot in the second half of the year. Pierre Gasly produced some great performances that really did help Alpine's cause, but I do think Hulkenberg could have finished in the points more than he did, because there were quite a few races up until that last, say, third of the season where Hulkenberg, got some points finishes, but it just wasn't happening enough. So that is probably, I think, the biggest reason why I haven't got him quite in my top 10, because considering how good the car was, I think he should have been scoring points just a bit more than he was. But still a good season for Hulkenberg, obviously going to Sauber next year. I really hope that Sauber do give him a good enough car to at least fight for points on, certain occasions. He's still one of the best midfield drivers on the grid, despite being almost 40 years old. And, Hulkenberg still, I wouldn't say at his absolute peak of his powers, but he's not far from it, is Nico Hulkenberg. And, cannot wait to see what he can do for Sauber/Audi in the future if he keeps up this level of performance. But just about getting ahead of him in my top 10, in 10th place, Yuki Tsunoda. And the reason I've gone with Tsunoda is because if you look at the Drivers' Championship, Tsunoda only finished 11 points behind Hulkenberg, which I think is just more impressive than what Hulkenberg did, and I think shows that Tsunoda did have a better season than Hulkenberg, because the Racing Bulls car in 2024 most of the time was not as quick as the Haas car. So for him to be not that far behind in points, and if you go and look at some of the points finishes Tsunoda had, he had quite a few, 7th or 8th place finishes. I remember, late on in the season in Brazil, had a 7th there in very, tricky conditions. And, I think Tsunoda was just about the better driver over Hulkenberg. Also, I think Tsunoda, for him to be consistently beating Ricciardo, and then when Lawson came in doing pretty much the same to him, at least in qualifying, I think does add stock to Tsunoda's quality as a driver as well. So I would just about put Tsunoda in 10th place, which I think is the first time ever I put Tsunoda in my top 10 for the end of season driver rankings. But it shows Tsunoda keeps getting better, and I would say top 10 drivers of 2024. As I said earlier, I think Tsunoda should be in the Red Bull for next year, but it looks like they're going to go for Liam Lawson. Even if Tsunoda's at Racing Bulls though next year, he's still going to perform well and be one of the top midfield performers. But my hope is that Aston Martin will see sense and get rid of Lance Stroll and replace him with Yuki Tsunoda. Of course, Aston Martin will be powered by Honda from 2026 on. And I'm sure Honda would be keen on Tsunoda, given how good Tsunoda is and how well he's performing, plus has quite a big fan base back in Japan. So Tsunoda really, I have high hopes for him for the future. He can definitely be a quality number 2 driver in a front running team, no doubt about it. It's just, will a top team give him that opportunity. That's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Just ahead of him, though, his good friend and ex-teammate, Pierre Gasly. I am going in 9th place. And the reason is because considering how bad the Alpine was, he still scored quite a few points mid-season for Alpine. But especially in these last quarter of the season, the last 6 or 7 races of the year, Pierre Gasly, yes, in an Alpine car that had improved, he was on absolute fire, scoring lots of points. He obviously had a 3rd place in Brazil, 5th in Qatar, was running so well in the final Grand Prix of the season, ended up finishing in P7. And because of his such great form in the final half of the season, was able just about to take 10th in the championship. So that's why I've got Pierre Gasly in 9th, because Alpine did not have a car that was as quick as the Haas car over the course of the season, or probably the Racing Bulls, you'd have to say as well. Yet we're still able to finish in 10th in the championship. So that's why I've got Pierre Gasly in 9th. And with Pierre Gasly, I do want to touch on him just for a further moment, because I think last year I may have had him ranked in my top 10 as well. And I just want to make the point that at the minute, Pierre Gasly is performing probably at his peak. And I really hope that Alpine next year can give him basically the car he's had for the final, say, few races of this year. A car that's able to be in the points every Grand Prix. Because Gasly, when he's in the form he's in, in 2024, which again is basically his peak form, he's able to be in the points every single Grand Prix. When he's in that form. Obviously, qualifying, he's still super quick driver. We've seen that quite a lot over 2024. And Pierre Gasly is also another driver that, if given a chance, could be a quality number 2 driver in a top team. Of course, he was supposed to be that for Red Bull, back in 2019. But at the time, he just wasn't good enough. He wasn't the same Pierre Gasly that we see now. The Pierre Gasly of now is way better than the one in 2019. So, yeah, Pierre, another great season, especially in what's been a pretty hard car to drive, especially with it starting the year overweight, and there being quite a lot of problems with the car. Still, obviously, the issue of a lack of power from the engine as well, compared to the other manufacturers on the grid. So, yeah, Gasly, fantastic season, and that's why I've got him in 9th. Now, in 8th place, Fernando Alonso. It's pretty difficult for me to put him any higher because the Aston Martin for so much of the season was so far off the pace of the front runners. We can't really compare him to those front-running drivers. But the reason I don't have him any lower than 8th is because clearly, if you go and look at the season, he was so still consistently finishing in the points, and really is the reason Aston Martin finished 5th in the championship. That's why he was clearly better than any of the midfield drivers like Gasly, Tsunoda, Hulkenberg, etc. So Alonso clearly has to be in 8th place, but you can't put him any higher really, because again, after those first 5 races, Aston Martin fell off a cliff of performance and were not able anymore to compete with Mercedes, McLaren, Red Bull and Ferrari. So you couldn't really compare Alonso to those others. After the first 5 races, though, I'd say Alonso was probably one of the top 4 or 5 performers out of that front group of drivers. But again, when that drop-off of performance happened, there was no way after that you could compare Fernando in terms of his performance level to, Hamilton and Sainz and Norris and, drivers like that. So, yeah, Alonso's got to be in 8th place. Please, Aston Martin, give him a car that is actually going to be good over the course of a whole season, not just for the first 2 months of a season. That would be great. We'll see next year, but I don't really have high hopes in terms of Aston Martin in 2025. 2026, I have much higher hopes, but we'll see how that goes for Alonso and Aston Martin. But at least he's still performing at a very high level, so that if that car does become a very good car in the future and they can maintain it, then at least Alonso's still at a good enough level to deliver in that car. So yeah, good to see Fernando still performing at a very good level at the age of, I think, was it now 43, which is just incredible. And of course, next year is the 20-year anniversary of Fernando's first World Championship. That's just how old Fernando is. But let's get on to, I think, what you guys are most looking forward to is the front seven and who I've ranked in what positions for the front seven. And we will start off, of course, with 7th place. And 7th place is the 7 times world champion, Lewis Hamilton. Now, I actually had Hamilton in my top 5 at the mid-season point ahead of Sainz and Piastri. But really, the reason I had him in my top 5 was because right before the summer break, he, of course, had 2 race wins and was in the races really starting to perform. Obviously, what was it? In Spain, he had a podium. Hungary, I think he had a podium, as well as those 2 wins at Silverstone and Spa. So, yeah, he was really starting to perform consistently in the races, which is why I had him up there. But the reason he's dropped to 7th for me overall for the season is because, one, his qualifying he just did not fix and it got even worse in the second half of the year. And those race performances where he was able to still be right there with Russell, if not beating him, stopped. He wasn't able really to have that many great race performances. Yeah, the final race of his Mercedes career was great. Las Vegas, of course, was another one. But it was much less those really good race performances compared to, again, say, the month of June and July, where he was consistently putting in some good race performances, which at least made up for him being beaten by George Russell so convincingly. And yeah, the head-to-head is just really bad for any Lewis Hamilton fans or Lewis Hamilton himself to even look at. It is quite horrific, considering Lewis Hamilton is statistically the greatest qualifier of all time. But yeah, because of the really poor qualifying and just not enough good race performances, you can't put Lewis Hamilton for me any higher than 7th place. Maybe some people will put him maybe ahead of a Sainz or Piastri and still have him in their top 5, but I can't put him any higher than 7th because, again, way too poor in qualifying and not good enough regularly enough on the Sundays either. And one thing I will say is 2024, without doubt, was the worst season of Lewis Hamilton's career. Let's hope next year for Ferrari, obviously a massive change for him. Let's hope he gets back to his best or even gets back to the level we saw him at in 2022 or 2023, where in those seasons he was still performing at a very high level. Maybe not his peak, but still at a very high level. Even that would be acceptable for, I think, Lewis Hamilton and Lewis Hamilton fans. So we'll see what Hamilton is able to do, of course, against Charles Leclerc in the same car. Going to be very interesting to see how that goes down next year and beyond. In 6th place, it was very hard to decide between 5th and 6th place, but 6th, just about, I have gone Oscar Piastri. Now, Piastri did improve this season. Obviously, his overtaking skill really shone in 2024. Had a couple very good race wins. Hungary, of course, he was very good. The win in Baku is still, for me, one of the best race wins of any driver in 2024. Because, you know, the overtake he did on Leclerc, and to hold Leclerc off in what was, I mean, the McLaren was clearly slower than the Ferrari in that Grand Prix, was just incredible. Still to this day, can't believe he actually pulled it off. So, yeah, the highs were very high with Piastri and had some, you know, some good qualifying performances. Obviously, didn't get a pole position, unfortunately, but The reason I've got him 6th is because, as I've mentioned before, lack of consistency. And that is why Piastri is still not able to match his teammate Lando Norris and is not able to be, I think, right up there consistently with your Verstappens, Leclercs, Russells and even Landos right now, because he just doesn't have the consistency. Again, when he's at his best, his best is right up there with anyone's best, but it doesn't happen often enough. A good example was, Baku, amazing weekend and an amazing win. And then in Singapore, he was so slow compared to his teammate and ended up, even though on the podium, he ended up, I think, was it over half a minute behind Lando, which is, that's over half a second per lap. He would have been losing on average, to Lando, which, you cannot accept that from, a driver compared to their teammate. And that did happen a bit too often, where Lando was up fighting in the top 2 or 3, and Oscar was maybe, fighting in 5th, 6th. And the Spanish Grand Prix was another great example of that, where Lando was finishing in 2nd. Wasn't far off Verstappen when Oscar finished, I think, in 7th place. Just lack of consistency. If he can improve on that consistency next year, I don't see why Oscar can't be one of the top, say, 3 or 4 drivers on the grid. But until he improves that consistency, then I don't see Oscar being able to be the number 1 driver at McLaren. And obviously that's going to be very hard for him then to be able to ever win a world championship. In terms of his race performances, I think there is a potential world champion in there. But again, it's the consistency which I think separates the absolute elite from the rest. And that's what Oscar has to find next year and beyond if he's going to be a world champion in that McLaren or in any car in the future. Just ahead of him, I went for Carlos Sainz in 5th place. And the reason I went for Sainz in 5th over Piastri is purely because of consistency. Because Sainz was just a bit more consistent and consistently closer to Leclerc than Piastri was to Norris. That's the only reason I've got Carlos Sainz in 5th place. Carlos had a good year, no doubt about it, taking 2 race wins in Melbourne and Mexico. When he was at his best, again, same with Oscar, he was, his best was a very high level. But that high level was not produced enough to be right up there with, say, 1st, 2nd, 3rd in my driver rankings. So that's why I've got Sainz in 5th place. The reason Sainz and Piastri, I've got them so close but not in that top 4 group, is because of the... even though Sainz was more consistent than Oscar, I would say, Carlos still, similar to Oscar, wasn't able to match his teammate consistently. And that's what separates Carlos Sainz, I think, from being an elite level driver. I know there are plenty of people out there that love Carlos Sainz and think that Carlos is one of the best drivers on the grid. I disagree. I think this season was probably one of the best seasons he's ever had in Formula 1. Sainz did the best he could probably over the course of the season. Maybe, had a couple of races where he wasn't quite at it, but I think this type of season from Carlos is really the best you're going to get from him if he's in a front-running car. Of course, though, next year he is in the Williams, and it might be quite a while until he's in a front-running car again. May never be in a front-running car again. Who knows? Formula 1 works in mysterious ways. So we'll see what goes on with Carlos Sainz. But I'd put him ahead of Piastri purely because he was just a bit more consistent than Oscar and was, again, consistently closer to his teammate in Leclerc than Oscar was to Norris. And talking of Lando Norris, he is in 4th place for my rankings. Finished, of course, 2nd in the championship, was Max Verstappen's closest competitor. But he did not deliver at all. in that championship battle. Now, I have to say, he did prove in 2024 just how electric he is in qualifying. He is very, very fast over a qualifying lap, and that does help him quite a bit with the results he gets. But his performances on race day just are not good enough. He is not a good enough race day performer. That's why Max was able to still, a lot of the time, beat Lando, despite Lando having the faster car. Spain, you could say, was a race like that. Silverstone, Spa, maybe. The US Grand Prix in Austin was another one. There was plenty of races where Lando had a faster car, but was still unable to beat Max for whatever reason, whether it was driver error, or just, not making the right decisions, maybe at the right time, or just not performing well enough, simply. Lando just was not good enough on race day, and that's really why I've got him in 4th place. I can't put him any lower because, Carlos Sainz, whilst he was consistent, Lando was, I think, quite a bit better than Carlos in 2024, quite a bit faster, and I think did perform at that highest level a bit more than Carlos did. But I can't put Lando any higher because, again, on race day, he disappointed way too much, and that's why he didn't win the championship or even come close to winning the championship. And going forward into 2025 and beyond, if he's going to win a championship, he has got to improve on his race day performances when it comes to the starts, keeping clean through a race and not making any silly mistakes, being consistent. He has got to improve on that because, again, if he does not, then he is never going to win a championship, especially if he's in a car that is in, equal pairing to, say, a Red Bull or a Ferrari, because Lando cannot get away with those race performances if they don't improve drastically in the future. So yeah, Lando Norris have gone for in 4th place, and his compatriot George Russell lines up for me in 3rd. George Russell has had a fantastic season, absolutely battered Lewis Hamilton, as we've seen in the head-to-head. Not just in qualifying, the races as well, Russell has been the better driver. Not been a perfect season from Russell. There has been the odd race where Russell probably could have done better, but considering how tricky this Mercedes car was to drive in 2024, I think he did remarkably well, to get 2 race wins. Also produced, I still think, a great drive at Spa. Even though he did get disqualified, I still think it was a great drive, what he did there, to finish, at least on track in 1st. I mean, if you take away the advantage that he got from being, I think, underweight, he still probably would have ended up on the podium. So I still think it was a great drive there. But, many times finishing on the podium when he didn't really deserve to, because he was able to keep his car in the fight, keep his car, in and around where he needed to be. Also took probably more pole positions than you could have really hoped for, given how poor Mercedes were at times in 2024. Russell, of course, taking pole in Canada, Silverstone, Vegas, Qatar. That was 4 pole positions for Mercedes, and 4 more than probably Mercedes thought even possible this season. So George Russell, given how well he has beaten Lewis Hamilton and how consistently great he's been getting the best out of that Mercedes car, which again has been very hard to drive, I think Russell has done incredibly well this year. this year. And next year, of course, has got the challenge of Kimi Antonelli, the superstar young talent, as his teammate. If he can beat Antonelli well, and Antonelli does have a good season himself, then Russell is putting himself right where he wants to be in terms of his performances for the future. Because if he can consistently perform at the level that he's been at this year, then Russell absolutely can win a world championship in the future. He's definitely a potential world champion. He just needs to make sure he doesn't slip back into the form we saw back in 2023, where Russell that year was quite disappointing, I have to say. So, yeah, more years like this, and Russell absolutely will eventually get his chance at a championship. In second place, the Ferrari driver of Charles Leclerc. First half of the season wasn't necessarily amazing. He did have plenty of good races. Obviously, the win in Monaco, what a weekend that was. But it wasn't really until, I would say, a couple races before the summer break where Leclerc's season really came alive, where Ferrari in the races started to improve. And from then on, that helped Leclerc regularly, week in, week out, deliver top performances. Getting pole, of course, at Spa in, I think, what was wet conditions, and ending up on the podium, despite the Ferrari not being very quick. Also on the podium at Zandvoort, even though the Ferrari was nowhere near quick enough for the podium, he still pulled off an amazing drive there to finish ahead of the McLaren of Piastri. And then, of course, won Ferrari's home race at Monza with probably, in terms of, you know, how the Ferrari car's pace was compared to the McLaren, it was probably an even better win than his win at Monza in 2019, where at least that weekend the Ferrari was the probably overall the quickest car and was a bit quicker than the one Leclerc had in 2024. So for Leclerc to get that win on a very tricky one-stop strategy as well, just incredible what Leclerc achieved there. Baku really should have won that race, but he was outperformed by Piastri, who was on an even higher level than Leclerc. And then we had further great performances. In Austin, Leclerc absolutely pulverising the rest of the field. And Leclerc really, I think, in the second half of the season was probably the best driver in the second half of the season. But because in the first half of the year, he was a bit hit and miss, I would say, bit inconsistent at times. That's only the reason why I don't have Leclerc as my number one. But if you look at ever since the ground effect era came back in at the start of 2022, Charles Leclerc has been the closest driver to Max Verstappen, no doubt about it. If you look at, you know, these 3 seasons we've had now of the ground effect era, Leclerc, if he is given a good enough car on a regular basis to fight for pole and the race win, and of course then fight for the championship, I think he would give Max quite a bit of a tougher time for that championship than, say, Lando Norris would, and maybe even, you know, tougher than, say, George Russell would. Leclerc is one of the best drivers on the grid, no doubt about it, and for me is definitely better than Lando Norris, Piastri, Sainz, and still, I would say, better than George Russell. And like I said, I think right now, based on what we've seen for the last 2 to 3 years, I think Leclerc is the closest driver on the grid to Max Verstappen. And again, as long as Ferrari can give him a car good enough to win the championship, there's no reason why he can't win it next year, even with Lewis Hamilton as his teammate. So please, Ferrari, give him that car, because it would be fantastic to see Leclerc versus Max for a championship in 2025 or beyond in general. And finally, of course, in first place, your 4 times world champion, Max Verstappen. Now, Verstappen did have his occasional dips at certain points, which wasn't necessarily down to him, but really the car. But the reason he won the championship was because he was the most consistent over the season. That's why he won the championship, because his form did not dip long enough for him to be beaten by Norris or, you know, to be caught by Leclerc or whatever in the championship. Obviously, the first, say, half of the season, he looked still untouchable, even when the Red Bull car was not, say, necessarily the quickest anymore. Then, Red Bull had quite a big dip in form from, say, the Hungarian Grand Prix until the Singapore Grand Prix. But Max still was able to get key results, beating Norris at Spa despite having a grid penalty, finishing on the podium at Zandvoort despite the McLaren being way quicker, finishing second in Singapore despite the car probably not being good enough to finish on the podium. The Ferrari was probably even quicker than the Red Bull in clear air in Singapore, and the McLaren definitely was. So, in that tough time of the season, was still able to keep picking up those key results. And then when the car improved again, when we came back for the US Grand Prix Austin, Max was able to get a good enough load of results then to win the championship over his main rival, Lando Norris. And yeah, Max, clearly the best driver of 2024. Like I said, not just because of certain drives he provided in 2024, it's mainly the consistency over the entire season, and that is what separates him from everyone else, is that consistency. Leclerc, again, second half of the year, I'd say Leclerc was probably the best driver in that second half of the season, but he wasn't at that same level in the first half of the year. And again, that's what separates those two for 2024. Max was at that very high level the whole year. Leclerc wasn't. Russell, he was at a very high level for most of the season, but not quite enough. Lando Norris, of course, we know, wasn't consistently at that level. So Max Verstappen, that's what separates him from the rest, because he is the most consistent and able to deliver on that most elite level the most out of anyone. And that's what keeps him as the man to beat in Formula 1. And we will see in 2025 whether he can still be the man to beat in Formula 1. But guys, that's it. That's my driver rankings. I've given my explanations, I believe, to the best of my ability as to why I've gone for drivers from first place all the way down to 24th. Now, I want to hear from you guys in the comments section. Why do you think certain drivers should be in first or second, third, fourth, fifth, or whatever position? If you want to, give me your top 10 in the comments, make sure to do so. But let me know in the comments section, most importantly, what areas of the field you maybe agree or disagree with me on with these driver rankings, and I will maybe respond. I will definitely have a look at your comments to see who's gone for who in what positions, just to get an understanding of where you guys think certain drivers deserve to be ranked for the 2024 season. So I'll definitely make sure to have a look at your comments. But remember, guys, I will be live on Sunday at 1 p.m. UK time to complete the rest of the season review for the 2024 Formula 1 season, where in that season review we'll go through the races and look at, say, the top 5 best races of the season, and also go through the teams and review how the teams did in 2024 and have a quick look at their prospects going into 2025. But that's it for my driver rankings video, guys. Again, comment below what your thoughts are for the driver rankings for 2024. And again, I'll have a look to see what you guys have to say. But until my live stream this Sunday at 1 p.m. UK time, and until my next recorded video, guys, it has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.